Spikers hit black woman's cheek. Just a moment later, they crashed to the ground in shock. The heavy glass door of Marlene's diner rattled against its frame as thunder rumbled across the Tennessee sky. Inside, the warm yellow lights flickered slightly, casting dancing shadows across the checkered floor that had seen 40 years of stories, secrets, and late-night conversations. 28-year-old Jasmine Carter sat alone in the corner booth, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. She stared at the acceptance letter spread before her on the worn Formica table, the words Harvard Medical School gleaming up at her like a promise she'd fought her whole life to earn. The rain began to tap against the windows, creating rivers of water that distorted the neon signs outside into bleeding colors of red and blue. She didn't notice the headlights cutting through the storm until the roar of motorcycle engines shattered the diner's peaceful atmosphere, making every patron look up from their meals with a mixture of curiosity and unease. The door burst open with such force that the bell above it didn't ring so much as scream. 7 leather-clad figures stomped inside, their boots leaving muddy prints across the clean floor that old Samuel, the janitor, had just finished mopping. Water dripped from their jackets, creating dark pools around their feet as they stood there, surveying the diner like conquerors examining new territory. The leader, a massive man with a gray beard that reached his chest and arms covered in prison tattoos, pulled off his helmet to reveal cold blue eyes that held no warmth, only calculation and cruelty. His name was Tank Morrison, though nobody dared call him anything but Tank, and he led the Iron Serpents, a motorcycle gang that had been terrorizing small towns along Route 49 for the past 3 years. Behind him stood 6 more members, each one looking meaner than the last, their faces weathered by years of hard living and harder choices. The youngest couldn't have been more than 20, with nervous energy that made his hands twitch toward the knife at his belt, while the oldest, a scarred woman named Viper, cracked her knuckles in a way that made everyone in the diner shrink back into their seats. Marleene herself, a sturdy woman of 60 who'd owned this diner since her husband passed 15 years ago, stood behind the counter with her hand hovering near the phone. She'd seen trouble before, had dealt with drunks and troublemakers over the decades, but something about these people made her stomach twist with a fear she hadn't felt since the bad old days when folks like her weren't welcome in certain parts of town. Tank's eyes swept across the diner, taking in the frightened faces of the regular customers. There was Betty and Harold, the elderly couple who came in every Tuesday for the meatloaf special, now clutching each other's hands under the table. Young Tommy, the high school quarterback who worked part-time as a dishwasher, had frozen in the kitchen doorway with a stack of plates in his hands. Even Marcus, the off-duty sheriff's deputy who usually radiated authority, seemed to shrink in his seat, his hand instinctively moving toward where his service weapon would be if he'd been in uniform. But Tank's gaze stopped and lingered on Jasmine, sitting alone with her coffee and her letter, the only person in the diner who hadn't looked up at their entrance, who continued reading as if 7 dangerous individuals hadn't just invaded this peaceful space. Well, Tank's voice rumbled like distant thunder, deep and threatening. Looks like we got ourselves a full house tonight. He walked forward, his boots creating a rhythm of intimidation against the floor, each step deliberate and heavy. His gang spread out behind him, taking positions that blocked both exits, a practiced move that spoke of experience in creating fear and controlling situations. One of them, a wiry man with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, grabbed a chair and spun it around, sitting on it backwards while leering at Betty, who pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders. Another, built like a refrigerator with legs, walked to the jukebox and kicked it, sending the needle scratching across the record with a sound that made everyone wince. The youngest one, the nervous one with twitchy hands, started picking up salt shakers from tables and juggling them, laughing when one crashed to the floor and shattered, sending white crystals scattering like snow across the black and white tiles. Marleene found her voice, though it came out shakier than she intended. "We don't want any trouble here. This is a family establishment. Y'all can get your food to go if you're hungry, but I'm asking you politely to respect my customers." She tried to stand taller, to channel the strength her late husband always said she had, But Tank just laughed, a sound like gravel being ground under heavy wheels. "Respect," he said, moving closer to the counter, close enough that Marleene could smell the mixture of motor oil, leather, and something sharper, meaner, the scent of someone who enjoyed causing pain. "Lady, respect is earned, and from what I see, nobody in this dump has earned anything from us." He reached over the counter and grabbed a piece of pie from the display case, taking a huge bite and letting the filling drip onto the clean counter. "Besides, we go where we want, when we want. Ain't that right, boys?" The gang responded with hoots and hollers, banging their fists on tables and making the dishes rattle. That's when Tank noticed Jasmine hadn't reacted to any of it. She sat there, still reading her letter, her coffee cup steady in her hand despite the chaos erupting around her. Something about her calmness, her complete dismissal of their presence, ignited a rage in Tank that had been simmering just below the surface. He was used to fear, to people scrambling to get out of his way, to respect born from terror. But this young woman, sitting there in her simple blue dress and cardigan, her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun, acted like he didn't exist. He stalked over to her booth, his shadow falling across her letter, blocking the light. "You deaf girl?" he growled, but Jasmine simply took another sip of her coffee before slowly, deliberately, looking up at him. Her brown eyes held no fear, only a tired kind of patience like a teacher dealing with an unruly child. "I heard you," she said quietly, her voice carrying a subtle strength that made Tank's jaw clench. "I just chose not to acknowledge you. There's a difference." The diner fell into a silence so complete that the only sounds were the rain against the windows and the broken jukebox clicking repeatedly, as it tried to play a record that was no longer there. Tank's face turned red, then purple, veins standing out on his neck like rope. Nobody talked to him like that. Nobody, especially not some woman sitting alone in a diner in the middle of nowhere. His hand moved fast, faster than anyone expected from such a large man, and the sound of his palm connecting with Jasmine's cheek echoed through the diner like a gunshot. The slap was hard enough to turn her head, to leave an angry red mark spreading across her dark skin, to knock her coffee cup over and send the cold liquid spreading across her acceptance letter, the ink beginning to blur and run. Betty gasped. Harold stood up halfway before one of the bikers pushed him back down. Marleene reached for the phone, but Viper was there in an instant, yanking the cord from the wall. Everyone waited for Jasmine to cry, to cower, to beg. That's what they expected. That's what always happened when Tank hit someone. But Jasmine did something none of them anticipated. She laughed. Not a nervous laugh, not a hysterical laugh, but a genuine, deep laugh that seemed to come from somewhere beyond fear, beyond pain. She touched her cheek gently, felt the heat radiating from where Tank had struck her, and slowly stood up from the booth. Even standing, she was a foot shorter than Tank, had to look up to meet his eyes, but somehow, in that moment, she seemed to tower over him. "You know," she said, her voice conversational, almost friendly, "my grandmother always told me that God gives us signs when we're at a crossroads. Signs to show us who we really are, what we're really made of." She stepped out from the booth, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with the violence that had just occurred. She survived things that would break most people. Saw her husband lynched for trying to vote, had crosses burned on her lawn for sending her kids to white schools, got spit on, hit, threatened, and worse. But she never stopped fighting, never stopped standing up, because she said every generation has to face its test. Tank's confusion lasted only a second before it transformed back into rage. "I don't give a damn about your grandmother or your stories," he snarled, raising his hand again. "You're going to learn what happens when you disrespect the Iron Serpents." But as his hand came down for a second strike, something extraordinary happened. Jasmine moved with the precision of a surgeon and the speed of lightning. Her hand shot up, catching his wrist mid-swing, her fingers finding pressure points that her anatomy textbooks had taught her, but that her other training had taught her to weaponize. Tank's eyes widened in shock as his arm went completely numb, his fingers refusing to respond to his brain's commands. Before he could process what was happening, Jasmine's other hand pressed against his elbow, using his own momentum and weight against him, and suddenly the giant of a man was airborne, flipping over her shoulder with a grace that seemed impossible given their size difference. Tank crashed to the ground with a sound that shook the entire diner, rattling windows and making the lights swing on their chains. He lay there, gasping, his brain trying to catch up with his body, trying to understand how a woman half his size had just thrown him like he weighed nothing. The other bikers stood frozen for a heartbeat, their minds refusing to process what they'd just witnessed. Then chaos erupted. Viper lunged forward with a switchblade that materialized from her boot, the blade catching the light as it arced toward Jasmine's face. But Jasmine was already moving, her body flowing like water around the attack. She grabbed Viper's wrist, twisted it in a way that made the woman cry out and drop the knife, then brought her knee up into Viper's solar plexus with enough force to drop her to her knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The young, nervous one came at her from behind, trying to grab her in a bear hug, but Jasmine dropped low, swept his legs out from under him, and he crashed face first into a table, sending dishes and silverware clattering to the floor. The remaining 4 bikers rushed her all at once, certain that numbers would overwhelm her, but Jasmine moved through them like a dancer performing a violent ballet, each movement calculated, precise, devastating. She used their size against them, their aggression against them, their expectations against them. When the one with the scar tried to grab her hair, she spun inside his reach, drove her elbow into his ribs with a crack that everyone heard, then flipped him over her hip onto 2 of his companions. When the refrigerator-sized one charged at her like a bull, she sidestepped at the last second, stuck out her foot, and sent him crashing through the front window in an explosion of glass and rain. Within 60 seconds, all 7 members of the Iron Serpents were on the ground, groaning, bleeding, trying to understand how their night of terrorizing innocent people had turned into their complete humiliation. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She walked over to where Tank was trying to push himself up, his arms shaking with the effort, and knelt beside him. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, but carried a weight that made everyone in the diner lean forward to hear. "You want to know something interesting about respect?" she said, making sure he was looking at her. "Real respect, the kind that matters, it doesn't come from fear. It doesn't come from violence or intimidation or making people feel small. It comes from strength used to protect, not destroy. From standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. From choosing to be better even when the world gives you every reason to be worse." She stood up, brushing glass from her dress. "My grandmother taught me that. She also taught me Krav Maga, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and 3 other martial arts, because she said a black woman in America needs to be ready for anything." The sound of sirens began to rise in the distance, getting closer. Someone, probably Marleene using the kitchen phone, had called the police. Tank tried to speak but only managed a wheeze. His gang members were in various states of consciousness, some holding broken ribs, others nursing dislocated shoulders or split lips. Jasmine walked back to her booth, picked up her acceptance letter, now stained with coffee but still readable, and carefully folded it into her pocket. She pulled out a $20 bill and placed it on the counter. "For the coffee and the mess," she said to Marleene, who stood there with tears streaming down her face, though whether they were from fear, relief, or awe, nobody could tell. The other customers began to slowly emerge from their hiding spots, from under tables and behind the counter, looking at Jasmine like she was something out of a movie, something impossible made real. Young Tommy was the first to speak, his voice cracking with excitement. That was incredible. Where did you learn to do that?" Jasmine smiled, a real smile this time, warm and genuine. "My grandmother was a combat nurse in Vietnam," she explained, sitting back down in her booth as if nothing had happened. "When she came home, she faced a different kind of war. She decided her children and grandchildren would never be victims, never be helpless. So she learned and she taught us. Not to hurt people, but to protect ourselves and others." She looked around the diner at all the faces watching her. She used to say that strength without compassion is just brutality, but compassion without strength is just wishful thinking. You need both to make a real difference in this world. Marcus, the off-duty deputy, had pulled out his badge and was checking on the bikers, making sure none of them were seriously injured despite their complete defeat. He looked up at Jasmine with professional interest. "I've been in law enforcement for 15 years, he said. "I've never seen anything like that." That was textbook self-defense, but more than that, it was controlled. You could have seriously hurt them, but you didn't. Jasmine nodded. They're bullies, not killers. They needed to be stopped, not destroyed. Besides, she added with a slight smile, I took an oath recently. First, do no harm. I'm starting medical school in the fall. I plan to be a trauma surgeon to save lives, not take them. But sometimes, she looked at Tank, who was being helped to his feet by Marcus. Sometimes you have to stand up to those who would do harm to others. Sometimes healing means stopping the source of hurt. The police cars pulled up outside, their red and blue lights painting the rain-slicked street in alternating colors. Officers rushed in, weapons drawn, but quickly lowered them when they saw the scene. 7 notorious bikers on the ground or barely standing, and a young woman in a coffee-stained dress calmly giving her statement. The story that emerged as witnesses gave their accounts seemed impossible. A single woman, attacked without provocation, had defended herself against 7 armed assailants and emerged without a scratch. But the evidence was undeniable. From the security camera footage that Marleene quickly offered to the hand-shaped bruise forming on Jasmine's cheek, where Tank had struck her first. As the bikers were being led out in handcuffs, Tank stopped beside Jasmine. The officers tensed, ready for trouble, but he just stood there, looking at her with something that might have been respect or might have been fear. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Jasmine met his eyes steadily. "I'm nobody special," she said. "Just someone who refused to be a victim. Just someone who learned that real strength isn't about hurting others, it's about having the power to hurt others and choosing not to unless you're protecting someone. You had all the power when you walked in here, and you used it to terrorize innocent people. I had the power to stop you, and I did. That's the difference between us." The next hour passed in a blur of statements, photographs, and paperwork. The rain had stopped, leaving the air clean and fresh, smelling of wet earth and new beginnings. Customers who had cowered in fear were now laughing, sharing their accounts of what they'd witnessed, each retelling making the story grow slightly more incredible. Marleene refused to let Jasmine pay for her coffee, instead insisting on making her a fresh cup and a piece of pie on the house for life. Betty and Harold shook her hand with tears in their eyes, thanking her for standing up to the bullies who had made them feel helpless. Tommy asked if she could teach him some moves, making everyone laugh when he tried to imitate one of her kicks and nearly fell over. But the most meaningful moment came when a young girl, maybe 10 years old, who had been hiding in the bathroom with her mother during the confrontation, walked up to Jasmine. She was clutching a worn notebook and a pen, looking up at Jasmine with eyes full of wonder. "My mama says you're a hero," she whispered. "Like in the movies, but real." Jasmine knelt down to the girl's level, her face serious but kind. "You know what makes someone a hero?" she asked. The girl shook her head. "It's not about being able to fight or being strong. It's about standing up for what's right, even when you're scared. It's about protecting people who need protecting. It's about using whatever gifts you have, whether that's strength or kindness or intelligence or creativity, to make the world a little bit better. Everyone can be a hero in their own way." The girl smiled and held out her notebook. "Will you sign this for me? So I can remember to be brave." Jasmine took the pen and wrote carefully, "To Maya, be brave, be kind, be strong. The world needs heroes like you. Jasmine Carter." She handed the notebook back, and the girl hugged it to her chest like a treasure before running back to her mother. Watching them leave, Jasmine felt something settle in her chest, a certainty that she'd been questioning since receiving her acceptance letter. She'd wondered if she was strong enough for medical school, strong enough to handle the pressure, the long hours, the life-and-death decisions. Now she knew she was. As midnight approached and the diner began to empty, Jasmine finally prepared to leave. The cook had come out from the kitchen to shake her hand, telling her that her meal would always be free at Marlene's. The entire staff had gathered to thank her, to express their awe at what she'd done. But Jasmine deflected the praise, insisting she'd only done what anyone would do if they could. As she stood at the door, Marleene called out to her. "That letter," she said, gesturing to Jasmine's pocket where the coffee-stained acceptance letter rested. "That's something important?" Jasmine pulled it out, looking at the smudged but still legible words. "Harvard Medical School," she said. "I've been accepted for the fall." The diner erupted in congratulations, but Marlene's response was the most touching. "Your grandmother," she said softly. "She would be so proud, not just of the degree, but of the woman you've become." Walking to her car, Jasmine paused to look back at the diner. The broken window was being boarded up, the glass had been swept away, and through the remaining windows she could see life returning to normal. People were laughing, talking, no longer looking over their shoulders in fear. She thought about the title the local newspaper would probably run tomorrow. "Bikers hit black woman's cheek. Just a moment later, they crashed to the ground in shock." It sounded sensational, like something out of a movie. But for her, it was just a Tuesday night. Just another test passed. Another moment where she chose to stand up rather than stand down. The aftermath of that night rippled through the small town like waves on a pond. The Iron Serpents, it turned out, were wanted in 3 states for various crimes, and their arrest led to the dismantling of a drug trafficking ring that had been plaguing the region. Tank himself, facing serious prison time, had something of an epiphany while sitting in his cell. He would later write a letter to Jasmine, not asking for forgiveness but thanking her for showing him that strength could be something other than violence, that respect could be earned through actions rather than fear. She never responded, but she kept the letter, a reminder that even the hardest hearts could change. The diner became something of a local legend after that night. Marleene had the security footage converted to a disc, not to share publicly but to keep as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, one person standing up could make all the difference. She had a small plaque made and hung by the door. "In this place, courage conquered fear, and one woman reminded us all what strength really means." Tourists would occasionally stop by, having heard the story, wanting to sit in the booth where Jasmine had sat, to see the place where David had defeated Goliath, where good had triumphed over evil in such a dramatic fashion. For Jasmine, life moved forward. She started medical school that fall, carrying with her the lessons of that night. When classmates complained about the difficulty of their studies, she would think about facing down 7 bikers and remember that she could handle anything. When professors questioned whether she belonged there, whether she was strong enough for the demanding world of surgery, she would touch her cheek where Tank had hit her and remember that she had already proven her strength in ways they couldn't imagine. She excelled in her studies, particularly in trauma medicine, where her ability to stay calm under pressure served her well. Years later, as Dr. Jasmine Carter, she would work in emergency rooms in some of the toughest neighborhoods in the country. She would save lives with the same hands that had once dropped 7 bikers, would use her strength to heal rather than hurt. And sometimes, late at night during particularly difficult shifts, she would think about her grandmother, about the lessons learned not in medical school but in the backyard of their family home, where an old woman who had survived unimaginable hardship had taught her granddaughter that true power came from knowing when to use your strength and when to show mercy. The story of that night at Marlene's diner became more than just a local legend. It became a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or carry badges. Sometimes they're young women sitting alone in diners, reading acceptance letters and drinking cold coffee. Sometimes they're people who have trained not for violence, but for protection, who have learned that the greatest strength is in lifting others up rather than knocking them down. The story was told and retold, growing with each telling, but always maintaining its core truth, that on one rainy night in Tennessee, when 7 bikers thought they could terrorize innocent people without consequence, they learned that hitting a black woman's cheek was the worst mistake they could make. The title of the incident became famous in the town's folklore. Bikers hit black woman's cheek. Just a moment later, they crashed to the ground in shock. But for those who were there, who witnessed it firsthand, the real story wasn't about the violence or the dramatic takedown. It was about a young woman who chose to stand up when everyone else sat down, who used her strength to protect rather than destroy, who showed that sometimes the smallest person in the room could be the most powerful. It was about the moment when fear turned to hope, when victims became witnesses to their own salvation, when one person's courage reminded an entire community what it meant to be brave. As the years passed, Jasmine would occasionally return to Marlene's diner when visiting home. She would sit in that same corner booth, order the same coffee, and remember the night that had tested everything her grandmother had taught her. Young people would sometimes approach her, having heard the story from their parents or grandparents, wanting to know if it was really true. She would smile and tell them that the details mattered less than the lesson, that everyone has power within them, power to stand up to bullies, power to protect the innocent, power to change the world one act of courage at a time. She would tell them about her grandmother, about the importance of being prepared but hoping never to need that preparation, about the difference between strength and violence. The diner itself became a symbol of resilience. Marleene kept it running for another decade before passing it on to her daughter, who maintained the same atmosphere of safety and community that had always defined the place. The booth where Jasmine had sat became unofficially known as the Hero's Booth, and people would request to sit there, hoping some of that courage might rub off on them. The repaired window bore a small plaque that simply read, "Courage lives here," a reminder of the night when everything changed. And on rainy nights, when the sound of motorcycles would echo down the highway, people in the diner would look up, not in fear, but in memory of the night when fear itself had been defeated. In her later years, after a distinguished career as a trauma surgeon, after saving countless lives and training dozens of young doctors, Jasmine would write a memoir. She devoted just one chapter to that night at the diner, treating it not as the defining moment of her life, but as one important moment among many. She wrote about her grandmother's influence, about the importance of preparation meeting opportunity, about the responsibility that comes with strength. But most importantly, she wrote about choice, the choice to stand up or sit down, to fight back or cower, to use your strength for good or for ill. She wrote about how every person faces these choices every day in ways both large and small, and how the accumulation of these choices defines not just who we are, but who we might become. The book became required reading at the local police academy, not for its fighting techniques, but for its philosophy of protection over punishment, of de-escalation when possible and decisive action when necessary. Tank, who had served 5 years in prison and emerged a changed man, even attended one of her book signings. Their interaction was brief but meaningful. A nod of acknowledgement, a moment of understanding that both of them had been transformed by that night in different ways. He had started a program for at-risk youth, teaching them that real strength came from protecting their communities, not terrorizing them. It was his way of making amends, of ensuring that the next generation wouldn't make his mistakes. The impact of that single night continued to ripple outward in ways Jasmine never could have anticipated. Young women in the town started taking self-defense classes in record numbers, not because they wanted to hurt anyone, but because they wanted to feel empowered, to know they could protect themselves and others if needed. The story inspired a scholarship fund for local students pursuing careers in medicine or law enforcement, funded partly by Marleene and partly by anonymous donations from people who had been in the diner that night. Even Hollywood came calling, wanting to turn the story into a movie, but Jasmine declined, saying that some stories were more powerful when they remained in the communities that created them. As this story draws to a close, it's important to remember that what happened at Marlene's diner wasn't really about violence or revenge or even justice in the traditional sense. It was about transformation. The transformation of fear into courage, of victims into protectors, of a moment of terror into a legend of hope. It was about a young woman who carried her grandmother's strength in her hands and her grandmother's wisdom in her heart, who proved that sometimes the greatest power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice to defend. The bikers who hit a black woman's cheek that night expecting submission found instead an immovable force of nature, and in crashing to the ground in shock, they created a story that would inspire generations to stand up, speak out, and fight back against injustice wherever they found it. The morning after writing this reflection, Jasmine stood in her office at the hospital where she now served as chief of trauma surgery. On her wall hung three things: her medical degree, a photo of her grandmother in her Army nurse uniform, and a small framed napkin from Marlene's diner with a coffee stain in the corner. Young residents would sometimes ask about the napkin, and she would tell them the story, always ending with the same words. Strength isn't about what you can do to others. It's about what you can do for others. Never forget that the same hands that can harm can also heal. And the choice of which to use defines not just your career, but your character. And in those moments, she could almost hear her grandmother's voice, proud and strong, reminding her that every generation faces its tests, and that passing them isn't about winning or losing, but about standing up when it matters most. This story, bikers hit black woman's cheek just a moment later. They crashed to the ground in shock, became more than just a tale of one night's violence turned victory. It became a testament to the power of preparation, the importance of courage, and the truth that sometimes the smallest seeming people can cast the longest shadows when they stand up to injustice. And somewhere, in diners and community centers and family homes across the country, other young women and men are learning their own forms of strength, preparing for their own tests, ready to stand up when their moment comes. Because that's what heroes do. They inspire others to become heroes themselves, creating an endless chain of courage that no amount of fear or intimidation can ever break.